So I'm Paul Hodges. I publish the PH report, which goes out to a mix of corporate and investor clients around the world. And what we try and do is to focus on the chemical industry as a unique window on the world. Because of the size of the chemical industry, it's the third largest industry in the world after agriculture and energy, and it gets into every single corner of the economy. So we get, and we've talked about this before, obviously, on Real Vision, we get 6 to 9 months advance warning of what's happening in the world just because we have that data and we have that insight. So that's really why I'm here.
The chemical industry, a slowdown that predates COVID-19.
I mean, I don't want to underplay, obviously, the seriousness of COVID-19 at all, but it is a fact that the chemical industry, we have very good data on this, and if I can just explain that, what we look at particularly is capacity utilization around the world, and we can look at that by individual country, by individual region, by individual sector. So if you want to know about materials, you want to know about fibers, you want to know about coatings, or whatever, or you want to know about China or the States, this all comes from the American Chemistry Council, who've got data going back to 1987. So we've got some very good parameters. And what this showed us was that the real economy, distinct from financial markets, actually peaked in January 2017 and was coming down fairly slowly, sort of like that. And then in December, it really began to fall off the proverbial cliff. And we've come down 10 percentage points to 86% from 86% to 76% over the 3 years. 5 of those percentage points, from 81 to 76, have come in the last four months. So the pace of the downturn has accelerated, and of course that was long before COVID-19 began to hit the world in February or March, depending on which region you were in.
The lag in chemical industry data.
Although we do talk about being real time, we do have to wait for the data to happen. So we're actually looking at March data now at the moment. So when we get April, I'm pretty sure that we will go below the 2009 number, but it is only 6-7 weeks since the end of April, so there is a time lag where people report, and you want to have data that is reasonably accurate. You don't want just to publish a flash number and then have to revise it upwards or downwards by a long way. So the American Chemistry Council do a good job on that.
The new normal.
So what we've seen is that, and it's interesting to compare with 2007 to 2009, because again, we saw the same kind of advance warning then, but what we saw in 2008 was a much sharper downturn and a much quicker one. Essentially, coatings took us into the downturn and it took us out again. Why coatings? Because it was a subprime housing crisis, and so you either the financial world collapsed because the housing market collapsed, or you did something about the housing market and it came back again. There was a knock-on effect, obviously, into autos because people had bought autos they couldn't afford from the money they'd made on trading houses they couldn't afford. But the rest of the economy was, probably in reasonable shape. What we've seen with the sector analysis over the last 12 months is that every single sector has been moving downwards. And so when we came into COVID in February and March, most of the sectors were already negative. Most of the countries and regions were already negative. Now, that is very different, and it implies to us, and obviously this is a matter for discussion. We don't know, but it implies to us that this is a different type of downturn, and that's why we're talking about this as the new normal, if you like, because what we're saying, a year ago we said we think this is the end of business as usual, based on what we'd seen from January 17 through to April 19. Now we're pretty sure that we're not going back to business as usual. We won't have a V-shaped recovery. Doesn't mean we won't have a recovery. Doesn't mean that if India sold no cars last month, which I think is the case, that India won't have a recovery and sell one car or whatever this month. Of course it will. The same with the UK. If the UK was down 97% on car sales last month, of course it's going to be up. But will it go back to 100%? No. You're looking at something in most areas, 70 to 90%. But of course you will have a downward movement, you'll have some pent-up demand, and then you'll have a recovery. And you'll see that in autos, you'll see that in construction, you'll see that in electronics. But the key issue for us is it like 2008 where, you know, the visitor from Mars heads off to Mars in the beginning of 2008, comes back in 2010 and says, well, what was all the fuss about? If the visitor from Mars is coming back at the end of this year, he's going to say, gosh, there's been a few changes here. And that's what I think is interesting, because I'm not forecasting the end of the world. I'm as the parlance, I'm always a glass half full man. I'm not a glass half empty man. So I'm always looking on the optimistic side, and there are a lot of new opportunities here. It's just that you've got challenges, and they're real challenges, and opportunities. And the opportunities, you'll probably be doing things differently.
Deglobalization in the chemical industry and beyond.
Well, I mean, if I could put a bit of personal history into this, my career has benefited a lot from globalization. And so in the chemical industry, I went to Houston, Texas in 1985 and set up our office there for a UK company called ICI that I was working for. And I was the first person from Europe to arrive in Houston. And our Texan friend said, well, why are you here? We said, well, because we're going to do business here. And we began to run global businesses, which we'd never been able to do before. But we already had the internet. We already had internal email. We had fax machines. We had direct dial phones. That was what you needed. I mean, it sounds trivial, doesn't it? But you can't run an international business if you can't pick up the phone and call someone. Or send them a message. We had telex, but it wasn't the same thing. But so we had all those things from 84 onwards, and the business began to globalize. And there was consistent demand because the boomers were growing up, and so they need more and more stuff. So the business logic was mapped on. If we look today, what we've seen is that those global supply chains that we set up are actually now proving very fragile and are breaking. If you look in the auto market, we saw that first, that the Wuhan, one of the main car centers in China, one of the original industrial centers, and very quickly you began to see parts that would have been made in Wuhan not getting to the West, and car factories shutting down. We kind of missed that effect because, after all, we weren't actually selling any cars ourselves here. So the fact we hadn't got any parts for them didn't really matter that much. But it was a fact. We're seeing that particularly now in pharmaceuticals. There's emerging crisis. I use the word, meaning crisis on pharmaceuticals, because 80% of generics are made or based on raw materials in China and manufactured in India. And the lockdowns that we've seen in both countries mean that actually we're going to have shortages of key generics. And so, the actions the governments are taking in order to reshore from global to local supply chains are going to become very widespread. And that's an example, if you like, where the whole pattern of industry that we've been used to for the last 30 or 40 years is going to change. This comes back to our point about recovery, because what you know is that if you're going to have to do things differently, you tend not to go straight from one mountain top to another one. You actually go on a learning curve. So you go down into the valley, you don't do it terribly well, but you kind of muddle through, and then you work out, oh, of course, that's what I should be doing. Yes, I understand now. And then you go back up the other side of the valley. So we're not going to be as efficient over the next 3 to 5 years as we have been in the past, but we will be more effective. In other words, we will have generics, but they'll be higher cost, unless we use modern technology to manufacture them. And that's another part of the opportunity. So you have local supply chains. Most of the stuff that was offshored in the chemical industry and in everything else was offshored with equipment that was basically 500 years old in concept. We've now got very much different types of equipment, very much different types of monitoring. So are we going to install the same equipment that we had 20 years ago? I think that would be crazy. So we're going to have to learn how to use the new equipment to manufacture the things that we're reshoring. That's part of the challenge, but also the opportunity. And we're seeing that right across the whole piece. That the final point that I think I'd make on that is we're convinced that we're going to see much more regional markets today. So, bad news for the shale revolution. The US is not going to become a great exporter of oil and gas because actually the markets are going to become much more regional, and chemicals, plastics and so on, polyethylene and so on. It was all set up to expand to sell to China. Well, if you have trade wars, China doesn't want it. China's expanding its own production. So there's going to have to be quite a rethink in some areas about how you run a business if it's going to be on a regional basis rather than global.
Winners and losers from deglobalization.
There definitely are going to be winners and losers, but they're going to be a bit different from the popular idea of this, because it's not. If you take China, for example, China's recognized for 2 or 3 years now that relations with the US have been reset by the US, and the idea of a partnership between China and the US is finished. So China has done two things. One is it's moved away from the idea of being the manufacturing capital of the world. And secondly, it's moved into its own go west model. And what I mean by that is about half of China's population, the urban part, did very well out of globalization. The rural half of the population, and we're talking 600 million people here, didn't do very well. 80 million are still below the poverty line, earning less than $2-3 a day. So you've got a big potential if you start to move away from the globalization and you start to pick up on the go west model. China can actually do quite well, even though it's no longer manufacturing to supply consumer goods in the West. Question for us here in the West is, how are we going? What are the products and services that we need today? Because they're probably not the same. We've got an aging population. People talk about aging populations in terms of, we need more healthcare, we need more walking sticks. That's not it at all. What we're looking at is a world where we don't get much growth because people like myself, instead of dying at pension age at 60 or 65, have another 10 or 15 years of life. But we're not economically very active. We're not having children. We're not needing to buy new stuff. In fact, we're trying to make do with what we've got and do more with less. Millennials, you don't have buckets of cash. You've got tuition fees and everything else to pay off. So you're trying to do more with less, which is why sustainability is a very good motto for both of us. But it does mean that economic growth is going to be quite different. And so the opportunities, I think, for companies today are not going to be around turning the handle and pumping out more and more stuff because, oh, great, we're going to be making it here in the good old US of A or in Europe or wherever. Actually, it's going to be a much more service-driven business. And what I mean by that is, instead of supplying tires, for example, to a trucking company, one of the things that you can do is to start using skills that you have in running chemical plants to help the trucking company manage its trucks better. In the chemical industry, we do preventive maintenance, so that a pump, for example, it's very detailed, but it's the kind of thing that creates the opportunity. We replace pumps, say, after their guaranteed period, 10,000 hours. We don't wait until they've gone 11,000 hours and then find the plant has got to close down in a hurry. We do it on a planned basis. That's not what you do in many trucking firms. You wait till you have a burst and you sit on the highway and you hope somebody will come along, and there's cost to all of that. So you can use those skills and you can do it on a cost-saving basis. So if if it's costing you $100,000 of lost time and you manage to save that $100,000, it's not unreasonable to say, well, you have 50,000 and I'll have 50,000 for finding the saving. So what I'm suggesting is that as we look about the reshoring, it's not going to be just about making the products. It's actually about adding the service element, because what we really want here is a solution. We're going to be doing things in a new way for a new need. We've got to do things, as I say, we've got to get more for less here. And so if you're going to do it in a new way, you want solutions, and that requires, thought. So it's actually, it's a very positive story in that sense.
Zeroing in on the near term.
Well, I think that what we can do, and let's admit we're flying blind, that there is there's no known model that we can look at here. The IMF has said potentially that we're looking back at the Depression. That may well be right, but the Depression wasn't caused by a virus in this way, because what's happened here is that we've actually cut back demand through the lockdowns. So this is really interesting, and what we're also seeing, and this comes directly to your point around China, is that China has come back to work. Wuhan and Hubei and so on are all, inverted commas, back to normal. There are outbreaks in certain Jinling and so on. It's 110 million people locked down again. But in the main, things about, what are you seeing? You're seeing people are going back to work. They are using public transport. They're using cars a bit more because they're worried about personal safety and so on. But they're not doing the discretionary things that they did before. So they may go to the shopping centre, but they're not buying. They're going for exercise to see their friends and so on. If they're not going out to restaurants and so on. And there's quite a bit of data to show that weekend behaviour is now quite different from what it was 3-4 months ago. And so that starts to resonate. If we look at what's happened in Italy, Italy's come back, Germany's come back, Texas, Georgia have come back on your side of the pond, and we're seeing behavioural changes taking place. And these behavioural changes, I think, are going to trump, to use a word, the pure economic changes. So what the financial markets are doing is saying, look, the Fed's put all this money in. We know what happens when the Fed puts money in. Stock prices go up, demand goes back up. That's it. Story over. What we're actually seeing on the ground, and I lived in Texas, so I have a son who was born in Texas. What I see is that most Texans are being pretty cautious. And you can say, how long will that last? We don't know. But across the population, some people are always going to be daredevils. Most people are going to be, if my journey is necessary, I'll do it. If I have to go and get some shopping, I will. But I won't consciously go and do it. So I think that in the travel and leisure industry, which starts to impact on the car industry, for example, we're going to see quite a different pattern of behaviour, much more local again, much less international travel. Much less international travel for business as well. A, because of the cost now, but B, because people are familiar with the technology in a way that they weren't before. If you move on from China, essentially what I'd say is that we're looking at China being, if you like, started in January and February, and so has more or less come into recovery mode now in May and will be recovering. But recovery is partly catch up. So May is probably a bit better than normal, if you like, going forward. June, July will probably disappoint. But, it was back at 100%. It was even a little bit higher than last year. And now it's gone down again. Answer, some cars, in the UK, some cars went wrong during April, and they had to be replaced, but you couldn't go to a garage. So you had to wait till May to do it. So you had some pent-up demand. I think in the States, what we're seeing is, of course, because we think of the States as a country, but of course it isn't. It's a continent like Europe, and you can see in Europe that parts of the continent have come through fairly quickly. I mean, Greece, for example, has come through with almost no trouble. Amazing. Portugal has come through with almost no trouble. They're not necessarily the countries you would think would do well, have done well. Some of the countries you would have thought would do well, like the UK, have not, and are still struggling. And you can see the same picture across the states. But let's assume that by the end of next month, Europe is through the lockdown period. Maybe kids aren't back at school or anything till September, but the basic thing. So June will probably be quite a good month. July will probably be a reasonable month, and then I think we'll start to see the second order effects of people having lost their jobs, the end of furlough schemes, government starting to worry about the debt that it's got, and certainly all we're seeing from China is the early warning. And you can argue China isn't necessarily, I accept that, but it's the only pattern we've got. What we see is that you do have some recovery, you do have some pent-up demand, but actually the more important thing is you're heading off in a new direction. And I think we'll see new directions. And some of the directions will last for a month, some of them will last for a decade.
Data series to watch.
Because we think that we're actually now at a tipping point where we move from inflation to deflation. I'm not saying that just because we had US CPI going negative, but that can always happen for a month. That's not my point. What I'm saying is we've got, this older generation, the seniors, the baby boomers, who are no longer economically contributing that much. They're very happy to be alive. They're nice people to be around, like myself. But we don't. So you can't get growth anymore. But the central banks have put in all this cash, and firms have therefore built capacity, which unfortunately isn't needed. If you have too much supply and not enough demand, you get deflation. Now, deflation, and I'm sure that we're going to start to see this in the second half of the year, and it will be persistent, does two things. One is it encourages you to defer a purchase, because tomorrow, if I don't need to buy it today, tomorrow it will be cheaper. So why don't I wait? It's the opposite of inflation. Inflation, it's going to be more expensive today. So if I can buy it today and borrow. The second thing is the borrowing, because it's been more expensive tomorrow, we've borrowed today to do it. Now with deflation, debt doesn't go down in value, it goes up in value. And so you want to minimize the amount of debt that you have, because in a week's time, it will be, in real terms, it will be larger. And of course, what debt does always is bring forward demand from the future. So if we have record levels of demand, that does imply we have brought forward record levels of demand from the future. So that's why I think that watching the inflation-deflation angle is very important. If we then turn to our three core industries, what do I think will happen? I think in autos, we will see some recovery, but we will see a recovery in a different way in different regions. So I don't think in China, for example, that they will go back to riding bicycles, because it's only 20 years ago that they stopped riding bicycles. If you go back to 2000, there were only 60 million cars in the whole of China. 60 million, for a population of 1.4 billion. Right? There were no cars. Everybody rode bicycles. And they were, in the phrase, dirt poor. Now, they've come a long way, but they don't want to go back to riding bicycles. In Europe, however, what you've seen is that people have, in Milan, in Paris, in London, and so on, places that you wouldn't necessarily have expected, people have said, we can see the sky for the first time. We can actually breathe the air without, people who've got asthma have suddenly found their asthma has gone away. Really tangible things. So there's a lot of pressure on the politicians to actually rethink city centres. I'm talking city centres, I'm not talking the rural areas. Rethink city centres and put the pedestrians and cyclists much more at the centre than the car. And all sorts of things play off that. Do I think that's going to happen in the States? I think, I can't imagine my friends in Houston starting starting to get on bicycles. Although, one may be surprised. I remember I used to cycle along Memorial Drive. Cars used to aim at me to try and knock me off the road for being un-Texan. So, different regions have different ways of moving forward. I think we'll also, in the auto industry, see a much more rapid move to electric vehicles in China and in Europe. And that will have a fundamental effect, because if you look at the chemical industry, for example, you use about 2,000 different chemicals under your hood. The nylon, the sound, and so on, all of that disappears. If you have batteries, you don't need it. You've got 20 moving parts. So it's a completely different animal. So I think the electric vehicles, and what you're seeing in China and what you're seeing in Europe, is governments and authorities saying, if you want help from us, well, we're not just going to bail you out as we did before. We actually want something in return. We want the greener economy. Whether that happens in the States or not depends, I suspect, on the election. So who knows? If we then move to housing, what's interesting, if I start with the States first, is that the last 10 years, we've never seen single-use housing return to the same level that we had before 2008. Really striking that the old McMansion type effect that everybody was building before 2008, the height of subprime, it's never come back. So those numbers are 37% lower than they were. And what you're seeing, and this is partly the effect, obviously, of house prices, is much more apartment living and smaller spaces. So that changes demand patterns quite a bit. And do people want to continue to live in small spaces in cities? Do they want to have smaller spaces in the suburbs? How does this work out? The people who get that right from an investment point of view are going to do very well. You might as well start today. In terms of electronics, if we look at smartphones as a proxy for this, smartphone sales began to go down 3 years ago. They've collapsed, obviously, more recently. But it opens up another question, which is another really big challenge stroke opportunity for investors, which is around the used smartphone market. 207 million used smartphones were sold last year. That number looks as though it's rising all the time. And the more I talk about this with people, the more they say, oh, my kids do that. Yeah, they buy and sell smartphones all the time. And so there's a very, and this is about fast fashion as well. Are you going to buy a dress or something to wear for a party and throw it away for $5? No, you're probably not. You'd rather like your granny's dress. Style and fashion is changing. So I think, and this is also true of the used car market, we're seeing all the troubles with the rental companies. How many rental cars do you need if you're not flying any planes? Probably not a lot. Will Hertz go bankrupt and so on? What you're going to see is the rental market is 20% of new car sales. So you're not going to see a lot of new car purchases from the rental companies this year. Some of them already said they're not going to buy any. They're trying to hand them back. I think quite a lot of them will go into the used car market. They'll need cash. And so they'll have to sell them off. So the prices of used cars will go down, and you'll be able to buy a relatively low mileage used rental car. That's going to drag down the price of new cars. So I think that we used to talk about the sharing economy. I'm not sure that the sharing economy works so well if you're worried about COVID-19, but I think the concept of recycling products in the sense of reusing them, I think that probably works very well indeed. And this is typical of what I'm saying, that what we're seeing in the chemical industry and what we're seeing in society is that you start down a track, it looks quite promising, but then you go, no, that's not going to work, is it? No, okay, right. But as I've come to here, now I can see that new direction. And that's a bit how it's going to be, I think. So there'll be some short-term stuff. There's going to be some kind of pickup in demand, because if there isn't, well, we're all dead. And I don't like to forecast that. So we're going to have that pickup. But then the more interesting bit is what happens after that in July and August, because that's the point when the winners and losers will start to be determined.
Mixed signals from the oil market.
Well, we're feeling still, as you know, quite pleased with ourselves. in that on the 1st of March, we publicly said when the oil price was $50, it's going to go lower, below 30. And we said it was going to go below the median oil price for the last 100 or 50 years. Median oil price is $24. Well, we were right. How about that? So, but one has to remember, and I've lived and worked in Houston in the oil trading market. This is not for widows and orphans. And there are some very big players in this market who, the hedge funds, the producers, the consumers, and then there are all the people who jump on what they see on Jim Cramer or whatever. And those people are having a very bad time because the big boys are playing the games that you would expect them to play. The market was wildly oversupplied. The market dropped. If you were a hedge fund, what did you do? You sold. Once you've gone, you didn't have to believe you were going to get to minus 37, but certainly once you got to 10 or below, you said to yourself, hey, I think it might be quite fun to play this on the upside. So you go, and let's face it, the hedge funds are 10 or 12 times the physical market. So you play it on the upside and you see how far you can go. And when you get to $30, you say, that wasn't bad, was it? I went from $50 down to 10. Now I've gone from 10 up to 30. What shall I do next? Well, Billy Bob, I think I'll go short again. and so you have to remember that what you're told is not what is reality. And I'm talking, I wear the scars on that. When I arrived in Houston, and it was a much more naive place in those days. I thought this time of year, I had begun to understand the gasoline market. And I went along at the end of May thinking the gasoline season has started, it's Memorial Day, and hey, presto, I've made money going up and now. And luckily, one of my industry friends said, don't want to do that, buddy. Don't want to do that. But no. Gasoline season's finished for the oil industry now, the refiners. If you haven't got it out into the pipelines, on the rack with the distributors, into the gas stations, it's too late. Imagine, how long does it take you to move gasoline from Houston up the Colonial Pipeline to New York? You can't do that in a week. Oh, I said, you think I should sell? Now. Stop lunch, go and call the broker, come back. Best advice I ever had, And so, we read what the hedge funds want us to read. We read what the majors want us to read. We read what OPEC Plus want us to read. We want the IEA and so on. Everybody's got an angle. And the game is not what they're saying, but how does this particularly balance? And we always come back at the end to supply and demand. And there is a heck of a lot of supply sitting around in tanks and not a lot of demand. If you look at the TomTom data online, just go to TomTom traffic data, put in your favorite city, and it shows you what the level of driving is versus what it was a year ago. And most places, it's not the same. We've not had that V-shaped recovery. And for the reasons we've discussed, I don't think we're going to get there. So people have committed to additional production in shale, in the Middle East, in Russia, on the basis of we're always going to be growing GDP at 3.5% and oil is always going to be growing at 3.5% or 4%. Well, actually, probably this year is going to be negative growth. So all that stuff you've been building for the last 5 years, there was no market for it. And I think this is going to be true of the whole market. The secret that an individual investor has is something called common sense. I remember when I was learning investment years and years ago, there was a guy called Peter Lynch who ran the Magellan Fund, largest mutual fund in the world. And Peter Lynch wrote books which are still valid today, Winning on Wall Street, One Up on Wall Street, and so on. And he said the ordinary investor sees things happening in their local area long before it gets to the street. So as long as you don't listen to the street that tells you, no, that's nothing important. Oh, and then suddenly wakes up to it, As long as you've got the courage of your convictions, you're okay. Now, we look at data. We have, I think, probably reasonably reliable and these days reasonably timely data on production. That data, it's massaged a bit, but it's probably about right. We have no data on demand. Oh, you say, but we've got refinery stocks. Yes, that's true. But refinery stocks are maybe 30% of the total, because you can measure refinery stocks and it goes from the refinery onto what's called the rack, goes out to distribution, goes down the pipelines, and it goes into the garages, and then it goes to the motorist. So you've got secondary storage and tertiary storage. So if I use common sense, and you're perfectly entitled to say, I don't agree, because this is what we're doing. What I suggest has happened is that nobody was particularly, before March, forecasting a downturn. So they probably all had reasonably normal levels of stock. Prices then collapsed. So what do? You get rid of all the stock you can. If you're a company, petrol service station, gas station, or whatever, you get rid of it. If you're a motorist, you run your tank down, and so on. So by the end of March, early April, everybody in the secondary and tertiary system is probably at tank bottoms. And then you say to yourself, well, I am doing some driving, and Memorial Day is coming along soon, so probably people will do a bit more driving then, and they'll probably drive a bit more than they would go by planes. So, not a bad time to top up, because gas prices are where they were compared to where they are. So you get buying. Now, what that translates into is partly a refilling of secondary and tertiary storage. It's not anything connected with demand. And this is my big point, that if you want to understand supply and demand, you actually have to understand really inventory changes, because that's what really drives the market. If we all think that everything is going to be stable, and it is stable, nothing happens. But if we have outages on one side or another, and the ordinary investor can observe those and can make their own judgment, what are you doing yourself? Am I buying gasoline today or am I not? Am I, personal behaviour? What are my friends doing? This is really valuable investment information, more valuable than watching. I would say the financial programs where people are parading what they'd like to be the truth.
Summary and takeaways.
I think the way that I would characterize my answer is to talk about directions of travel. That I think if you get clear in your mind, this is where we're going, you can then start to set milestones in place to say, well, if we are going that direction, if I'm going to drive from Dallas to Houston, I probably have to get onto the loop first, and then I have to get onto the I-49 and so on. So and those milestones come along easily enough. So my first milestone is that we're going to be doing more with less. So you need to be thinking about services and providing solutions rather than just products. So in other words, I've got these technical people here who are pretty good. I've got these commercial people who are pretty good here. What else could they be doing? And in fact, what's interesting in some cases is stuff that they're already doing but they don't charge for could turn out to be more valuable than the stuff that the stuff, if you like, that they're selling. I think that the markets are going to focus on durability and sustainability. Doing more with less is important. I think that businesses that were seeing themselves as global have to pivot, to use the phrase, very quickly towards being local. And they've got to think about when they set up local supply chains, as I was saying about the pharmaceuticals and generics area, what I think they need to be doing is not simply replacing what was there in the past, but thinking about future-proofing it. What do I need in order to be efficient and cost-effective in the future? That's going to be very important, I think. I think that actually inventory is going to be quite a drag on performance. Because things are going to change quite a bit. If I'm right about the auto industry, that we see a recovery and then it peters off, You don't want to be buying a lot of cars if you're an auto or making a lot of cars today on the assumption that you're going to be selling, in inverted commas, normal quantities in September, because you probably won't. So being agile and having a much better view. What we don't get at the moment very well is a view down the value chain. Manufacturers know about their first customers, but they don't know what's happening in Walmart. They don't know what's happening on the lots of the dealers. They need to. They need to follow that. In other words, we're moving towards a market now which is demand-led rather than supply-driven. If you go back, Jack Welch used to say at GE, remember GE? As long as I'm in the top 3 in terms of cost, then lowest cost, I'm in business. And so if you've got low-cost supplies, that's all. Today it isn't. Actually, everybody's got low cost because there's so much surplus around. What you need is a customer. Have you actually got a customer here? If you have, and the customer can afford to pay you, which is quite a thing, then you're probably in business. I think that the growth of second-hand markets is going to be a very interesting opportunity. We talked a bit about used cars, used smartphones, and so on. I wouldn't put a lot of money into new build myself, but I would, I think existing homes. That market is going to get quite interesting if you're a realtor. I think we've got to assume that international travel and leisure itself is going to be reinvented. People are still going to want to travel, still going to want to meet their friends and family and so on. Nothing wrong with that, but they're probably going to do it in different ways. And again, common sense is going to tell you, look, if that's what my family is feeling like doing, when I suggested let's all get on a plane and go to Honolulu and they all went, no, that probably tells me something about most people in the West. So they probably go. But if you say, hey, look, we're going to hire a ranch up in the mountains, fine. So common sense is going to be a great guide in all of this. And the other thing, I think, what's my final point? My final point is not to be afraid to make mistakes, because we are moving, I think, into this new normal world now. And anybody who thinks they know what's going to happen is wrong. What you can do is you can set out on a direction of travel. You can say people are still going to need shelter. They're still going to need mobility. They're still going to need health. They're still going to need food. They're still going to need water, all of these things. But they may well want to have them in a different way. Now, they may start off wanting them in this way, decide they don't really want them that way at all, it doesn't work at all, and you go to something else. That's, business models will change and they will evolve over time. But if you're using common sense as an investor and you're thinking about, well, does that make sense to me to do that? Part of the answer is, well, not everybody's like you. Fine. Okay, understand that. But in the main, common sense will stop you making bad mistakes. And, if you make some mistakes, I used to, when I was trading, I remember I was told off at one point by a very senior manager who said, you've not been taking enough risk. And I said, but Robert, I don't want to lose money. Paul, you're not here not to lose money. You're here to make money. And you won't make money if you don't take risk.
Hey there, since you got to the end, I'm guessing you liked the video. And that's probably because we don't just turn on a camera and film. We work really hard on getting the narrative flow just right. And that's why many finance companies are actually now hiring Real Vision to make videos for them. One of our recent client videos just hit 100,000 organic views on YouTube, and there were no kittens in sight. So if you want to find out how Real Vision can make a video for your company, just email us at customvideo@realvision.com.